the A-12 program was substantially over cost and behind in schedule. Given the fact that this information was available in all three offices, why was it ignored?
I don't know.
The Navy saw the Air Force starting to get all these stealth airplanes. Of course, it became very jealous because it could see that its role was going to diminish. So it wanted to come up with a stealth airplane.
In my view, they were over-ambitious with the design, they were over-ambitious with the technical details, and they had more expectations from the stealth than proved realistic.
General Dynamics teaming with McDonnell Douglas and then Northrop, they said it will be for a $4.8 billion with a B dollar fixed price contract. At no time did Northrop ever agree to build it for that price. If you're not going to adhere to the specifications of the contract, you're really not a competitor. The Navy kept Northrop in the competition so that McDonnell Douglas and GD would think there was a real competition, which of course is a violation of a lot of things. So there was a charade from the beginning. By the fall of 1989, the A-12 was exhibiting weight, schedule, and cost problems. So in the fall of '89, after the Berlin Wall fell, Dick Cheney issued a memorandum asking for people to contribute information to what he called the Major Aircraft Review. He wanted to go up and talk to Congress, since he was a former congressman himself, in April of 1990 and say, here's the state of the contract. Dick Cheney issued a memorandum asking for people to contribute to a presentation he wanted to make the following April 1990, April 26th to be exact. And he asked for these contributors, and it took several months, and people would contribute information. And about a month before he made his presentation, he got 4 warnings in writing and verbally that the A-12 was a problem. One of them was a briefing, oral briefing, said it was $1 billion over budget. And since it was a fixed price program, it meant that GD and Mac Air would have to pay for that. Cheney has no recollection of that meeting. And according to his Undersecretary of Defense, when I told him that Cheney said he had no recollection, he said, well, that's impossible.
Well, I think that the merchants of death out there oversold the A-12, and they said they could deliver on this product, which was very fanciful, and didn't happen.
Because that Undersecretary of Defense, John Betty, had written Cheney a memorandum, which also sent to everybody in the upper echelons of the Department of Defense, saying of all the airplane programs that you're going to be briefing on April 26th, the A-12 is the only one I have a problem with. And it was his people that briefed Cheney on it being $1 billion over budget. Whenever there's large amounts of money involved, the Department of Defense has various levels of decision-making, and in one of these final decision-making, they all agreed they were going to have a new airplane. The title of my book is called The $5 Billion Misunderstanding. And the reason it's called a misunderstanding is because half the room left thinking it was going to be a new airplane, which was code for stealth, and the other half thought it was going to be an upgraded airplane like the A-6F. Dick Cheney had lots of warnings about the A-12 being a problem, and then when he testified in front of Congress on April 26, he said the A-12 has been well handled to this point.
I think the reason that the A-12 was pushed was not so they'd have something that would be a miniature B-2 stealth bomber, for instance. It was more the contractors promising more than they could deliver. And the costs also went skyrocketing.
When Cheney decided to terminate the A-12, he called in the Navy and gave them a sort of last chance to tell them why he shouldn't terminate it. They made their arguments, and Cheney decided to terminate the contract. There was an A-12 program, but the only thing that was in the A-12 program was this contract. So in a sense, You don't terminate a program for default. You can only terminate a contract for default. He didn't say, I'm terminating the contract for default. He said, I'm terminating the A-12. And he later acknowledged it was for the contract. He then turned the responsibility over to the Navy's contracting officer, and that officer had a choice between termination for default or termination for the convenience of the government. In one case, the contractor would be paid, and so would the subs, and in the other case, they get nothing. He being the contracting officer, felt that to let the contractors be paid would be a windfall and was not in the best interest of the government. He wanted to continue the program because he knew how desperately the Navy wanted it. There are several investigations about the A-12 program that happened over the summer of 1990. In July of 1990, Cheney issued a letter to the Senate Majority Leader asking for more money for the A-12. He was denied the money. And from that point on, Cheney and his group of leaders did everything they could to justify the cancellation of the A-12. Remember, they had a war coming up in January of 1991, which was against Iraq. So they were looking for money anywhere they could find it. So Cheney canceled the contract, and the Navy implemented the cancellation. The contract, if he hadn't canceled it, they would have been obligated to issue $553 million, roughly $500 million, against the contract, and they wanted to avoid that because they wanted to use it for other purposes. When Dick Cheney terminated the contract, which he did, which he said he did, he stepped into the shoes of the Navy's contracting officer. That meant he had to follow certain regulations. The regulations require a 7-step process, and that 7-step process takes several months to do. Because this was done over the weekend and the following Monday, $553 million was due to be applied to the contract. It was a rush, and it was all done on that Monday. And what they did was, they meaning the contracting officer and his legal assistant, they took out an older document that was done to terminate for default the Lockheed P-7, which was a follow-on concept to the Orion P-3, and they dusted it off and they filled in the blanks with typos, blanks, and inappropriate statements. For example, one of them was, they said that the A-12 was being terminated because it couldn't make its runway takeoff length. Well, you don't have a runway takeoff length requirement in an A-12 because it's shot off an aircraft carrier with a catapult. And when she was interviewed, this is Peg Olson, when she was interviewed in trial, the attorney asked her, well, now, Miss Olson, isn't it reasonable to say that with the slightest amount of review you would have caught these? And she said yes. And the attorney told me it was one of the most sophomoric pieces of work he'd ever seen. So that is what Cheney should have done but didn't do when he terminated the contract for default. He terminated it, well, it's not really fair to say he terminated it for default. He terminated the contract, and the Navy's contracting officer, acting as a pencil, terminated it for default. But that was just fulfilling Cheney's wishes, because if he didn't terminate it for default, you'd have to pay out all the money. And that's what they were trying to avoid, because the war was coming up in just a few weeks. Cheney made false statements to the Congress because he said that no one could tell him how much the airplane was going to cost, which is why he terminated the contract. When he made that statement, which was about 6 weeks after he had done it, I guess he had forgotten that he was told the day he canceled the contract a very precise number, $7.5 billion is what it would take to finish the program. That, by the way, was the exact number that the Navy used before the program began when it was trying to estimate what it would cost. So Cheney, on many occasions, made statements that were just not true. And again, to accuse somebody of, I'm not accusing him of lying, because that means I know what his mental state is. But I can tell you that the statements were false. For example, he wrote a memo to President Bush the first one, and said, my team didn't tell me how bad the A-12 program was. Well, he got 4 memos on the A-12 program, verbally or in writing, so he knew exactly what it was. In fact, the guy who told Cheney, did you say $1 billion overrun? And Cheney, and the guy answered yes. So Cheney was well briefed on this. So he just must have had some sort of disassociation with what he'd been told to be able to say no one could tell me what it was going to cost. Right after Cheney terminated the contract, of course, that was in January. In June, the contractors filed a lawsuit, June of 1991. Here we're coming up to 2011, that's 20 years. So why did it take so long? Well, the reason it took so long is because the contractors won at the trial level and the government kept appealing. Okay? And in those appeals, you have wins and losses. And in each case, there was either a neutral, send it back to the trial for more clarification, or the government won. So finally, the contractors are appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court on one of about 20 reasons. What happens in a contract when people sue each other? They start coming up with excuses. Well, you didn't do this or you didn't do that. So there were a bunch of reasons that the contractor cited as to why they were unable to fulfill the contract, most of which I felt were legitimate. So they get to the Supreme Court and they take out what they think is their best shot, and that was the State Secrets Act. Essentially, the State Secrets Act says this: in order for us, the government, to defend ourselves, we would have to divulge information that is so secret it would harm the country. And therefore, we are not going to proceed. Now, according to the legal advice I've been told, the government's perfectly at liberty to do that. But if they take that position, then they have to pay the contractors. But in this case, the government is arguing, not only do we not have to give you any information so that you can show that you were not at fault, you, the contractors, but we're not going to tell you anything. We're just not going to give you anything, and so you're going to lose. And there's some argument in the Supreme Court oral argument that, hey, that's not really fair. You know, if you're gonna do that, then you got to give up the money. You don't have to tell them, but you got to give up the money. You lose.
So the way the contractors get well, this is an old game. Everybody who's in Pentagon procurement knows it. They say, well, you changed 1,000 things on this airplane, and we're going to charge you for each one of those changes. That's how they get well. That's how they make money. The basic problem with military procurement in the United States today is that we're allowing the defense contractors, allied with the Congress, to take us to the poorhouse in Cadillacs. So what do the contractors do? That's a severe loss of money if it's canceled for good cause, because it couldn't live up to the specifications in the contract. So they said, in the first appeal to the courts, which I covered some of, that he didn't follow correct procedures, that he ignored the rules of canceling a contract. So the issue going into the first round, and there's been several rounds in the courts, as you know, and it's still not over, that the poles of the argument were Cheney was beyond his authority by the way he canceled the contract. And the Navy's response through the Secretary of Defense was it couldn't live up to the contract performance-wise, specifications-wise, so it's a flawed product and we're not going to buy it. So we have just cause for canceling a contract because it can't perform as advertised. The contractors' fallback, McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics, was, yeah, but there's certain ways that you have to cancel a contract and there's certain appeal processes and you ignored all those rules. So that was the issue. Looking through Defense Secretary Cheney's end of the telescope, I can see why he couldn't get answers to A, no one knows what it's going to cost, B, no one knows what it will be able to do, C, nobody knows whether it can withstand the pressures of a carrier deck. What was the threat? Who had a A-12? Nobody. And you could make a case nowadays, why not deal with it with unmanned aircraft and then send in something simpler and cheaper than the A-12? Cheney couldn't get solid answers, and he just said, "To hell with it, cancel it." And he went out to St. Louis and canceled it on the spot.
The history of the Department of Defense is that all programs run into problems, and there was nothing unique about the A-12. There was no reason to think that it wouldn't continue. I mean, historically, programs get into problems, they throw money at it, and it either gets fixed or it doesn't get fixed, but in most cases it continues whether it's fixed or not. The A-12 program was doomed to failure from the very beginning for the simple reason that not enough money was funded for the airplane, for the development of the airplane. The 4.8 was less than the 6.8 that was appropriated for just one phase of the F-22. Basically, all airplanes in development go through 3 phases. At the time, the first phase was called concept formulation, where you have a bunch of paper studies. The second phase was demonstration and validation portion of the advanced tactical fighter, which eventually became the F-22. Both Northrop and Lockheed developed airplanes. They each contributed 2 airplanes. One was called the YF-23, that was the Northrop airplane. One was called the YF-22, that was the Lockheed airplane. The combined amount of money spent on that phase of the airplane was a significant amount more than was programmed for the entire A-12 program. So you have these 3 phases: concept formulation, demonstration and validation, and then full-scale development. That's when you build the actual airplanes and start flying what's supposed to be the end product. There was never enough money in the A-12 program. It was doomed because there wasn't enough money, and everybody knew it. Everybody I ever interviewed said everybody knew it was doomed, but like all programs, they thought they were going to get whole on production. So when Dick Cheney, when he gave his talk on April 26, 1990, the Major Aircraft Review, he basically cut the program in half. So there was no way they were going to get whole. So the contractors came and talked to Dick Cheney in June and said, "We can't get there from here. There's not enough money." And Cheney had some options, but he doesn't even remember that conversation either. So it wasn't until July that he asked for more money. Congress didn't give it to him, so the A-12 program never had enough money to adequately do what needed to be done. When you're talking about research and development, you don't really know what you don't know. You don't really know when things are going to happen. So if you came to me and said, "How much would I charge to do something I had never done before?" I'd say, "I don't know. I'll just bill you hourly until I get there." A friend of mine once said, "Inspirations come, but not on schedule." So that's what Tom Jones told me when I interviewed him about his part of the A-12 competition. He said, "We built stealth airplanes. We knew what the problems were. We knew that you could never make a fixed price contract for a research and development airplane because you don't know." So he thought it was just ludicrous. So that's why he made his so expensive that they were never really considered a competitor, because he didn't want to end up losing money. So he essentially converted his proposal from fixed price to a cost plus. And that's why the A-12 was never going to be built, because it didn't have enough money in the first place. If you look at the F-22 program, you had the middle phase, the demonstration and validation. That was probably 20 or 30% more than the whole A-12 program. And since then, they spent probably in today's dollars, $15 or $20 billion. The A-12 program was premised on the fact that the Air Force was going to share information with the Navy. That was done in 2 ways. One, it was in the specification, which was incorporated into the contract, that the Air Force would give the information. And secondly, there was a memorandum of understanding between the Secretary of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Navy that they would share information. That information was never shared. It was asked for many times. It was never forthcoming. So That meant that the contractors who had never been cleared into any stealth programs were not able to use, if they had some personal knowledge about stealth, they were not able to use it because they had to justify the basis on which they were building the airplane. So it would be kind of like a blind man trying to tell you what the inside of a cave looked like and he can't touch the walls. There's just no way to figure out how to do it. So they ran down a bunch of blind alleys, but towards the end, they actually started getting closer and closer. There is a duty, according to many of the lawyers that I've talked to on the program, a famous case called Helene Curtis, that says that a government can not remain silent and allow a contractor to enter into a ruinous course when the government has the information. They have a duty to share it, and when the judge in the first trial looked at the contract, he said, you have a duty to share it based on the specification. Never happened.
Well, just to back up on the realities of contracting, when Robert S. McNamara came to office at the Pentagon as Secretary of Defense in 1961, there was a competition for what was then called the Tactical Fighter Experimental, TFX, which became the F-111. And they had 3 separate competitions for the first time. McNamara had demanded that the competing contractors, who were then Boeing and General Dynamics, share each other's information after every competition of those 3 different awards, the 3 different competitions. And so it's standard practice that once you're bidding for a government contract and you have some technical information that would help your competitor, the Pentagon has the right under most contracts to tell X what Y knows that he doesn't know. And so it would be unusual for a contract where taxpayers' money is being spent for the F-1117 people not be able to talk to the A-12 people. But it could have been, I don't know that for a fact, but the standard practice is you share information because it's all owned by the government.
The reason that the Air Force did not share the information, in my opinion and the opinion of many other people, is that we're back to the budget share problem. The Air Force, missions and budget share. The Air Force wants to have it all, the Navy wants to have it all. Anybody who doubts this, all they have to do is go back and look at the carrier battles back in right after World War II. The Air Force said, you don't need to give money to the Navy because with our B-36 that's coming online, we can drop nuclear bombs all over the world at a moment's notice, so the Navy is irrelevant. The Navy, on the other hand, argued, well, you may not always want to eviscerate your enemy. You may just want to kick him in the toe, and that's when you need the aircraft carrier. So there's always been this rivalry and jealousy between the services, and they guard, like you can't believe, their budgets, and they will not do anything to cooperate with each other. Northrop didn't share their technology with the A-12 team because, after all, it'd be like a competitor sharing with another competitor. They were competitors. So the Air Force didn't want to do it based on just parochial interests, and Northrop wasn't going to share because they're a competitor in the program.
First of all, what happens in the real world is contractors have to make a living, right? So they're always trying to sell the better mousetrap. And they're continually promising things they cannot deliver on. They can't deliver on cost, they can't deliver on performance, and the reformers that I respect say, why not have a fly before buy? Why not compete 2 airplanes against each other and see which one is better? Let's forget about all this brochuremanship from the contractors who have a vested interest in selling the airplane. And it's always talked about, but it's never really put into practice. And the specs never are fulfilled. Even the C-17, which is a very popular transport airplane, never lived up to its original specs.
Towards the end, when it was clear that the A-12 was not going to stay, the Navy tried to show that it was still a valid concept. And so if you were to sit in those meetings, they were meeting all the goals that the Navy had set up for. Not necessarily the first goals that they set in the contract, but the ones the Navy sort of caved in on over time. The Navy wanted this airplane desperately. It was a love-hate relationship. The A-12 program was so secret that when I showed a document to former Vice Admiral Robert Dunn, who was in charge of the aviation operational side in the Navy, I put the document down. He picked the document up, he looked at it, he looked at me, and he looked at it and he looked at me, he looked at it again and he looked at me, and he said, you know, when I signed this, I never thought it would see the light of day. He said, I should have listened to my good friend, and he named his friend. He said, never sign anything unless you expect to see it on the front page of the Washington Post. And that document that he signed was basically telling someone he wanted to work back channel, that he didn't want to have to divulge this information to the Congress for fear that Congress would shut down the program when it started running into problems in the very beginning. It was in the mind of Herb Fenster, the attorney that represented the A-12 team, or at least the GD component of it. Admiral Dunn's failure to notify the Congress was the single most duplicitous act in the entire A-12 program. At the first trial, the contractors won. And they won because they were suing the Navy, saying that you failed to terminate the contract properly. You failed to follow the 7 steps. The judge agreed, awarded the contractors by changing it from termination for default to a termination for convenience. The Navy said, or should I say, the Justice Department lawyers representing the Navy, they said, well, wait a minute, Judge, we can show egregious default. In other words, they first said, well, there was criminal activity, and the judge says, well, show me the criminal activity. And they said, well, we can't find that, but we can show you egregious behavior, which they call the egregious default trial. So for about a year, that went on. And the only thing that the Navy could show was that the contractors were overweight by 704 pounds. And of course, that was ludicrous because there have been many other programs that have been overweight far more than that that are still flying today. The A-12 began life with unappropriated money. What that means is that the prohibition in the Constitution, which says the executive branch cannot spend money unless Congress has approved it, spend it anyway. And the way the Navy got around it was it has a lot of black programs, and it would take these black programs and put it into a big pool, kind of like a winemaker. Instead of going to the Naval Air Systems Command, where the money should have gone, where it was appropriated to, it went to the Naval Supply Systems Command, into a fund. And in that fund, they mixed the money together like they're blending wine, like the French do. And then they would ladle out the money wherever it was needed. And this was found out because there was a label left on some of that money that said it was for another purpose. So that was one of the counts in the ultimate lawsuit. So the unappropriated money doesn't really slow down the military services if they want to violate the law. And it is a felony to violate the law, because Congress in the early 1800s was getting all these bills for things that never approved. So Congress got tired of that and decided to make it a felony. And have you ever heard of anyone being prosecuted for that? I haven't. Some people ask me, who is the villain in this case? What they don't understand is the way decisions are made in the Department of Defense. Most of these decisions are group decisions. That way, everybody shares the blame, and there's nobody that they can point the finger at. It's this fungibility of responsibility. Nobody's responsible.
There was a decision made, which again, each of you have used the word we. Was it put in writing, Admiral Morris? Yes or no? Somewhere you all have used the we, and we're going to find out who we is.
And her staff.
Whose decision was it to make? Was it your decision? Whose decision was it?
Now, in the case of Cheney, he is responsible for canceling the contract just a few months after he said it was well handled and he asked for more money for it. So the reason he canceled it is obviously not because it wasn't well handled. He'd said it was, unless he was lying. It's not because he didn't because he had the money. He didn't have the money, so he had to make a decision. What am I going to do? So he canceled the program so he could get them out of the picture, get them terminated for default, free up the money for the war. And by the way, right after that, he allowed the contractors to not pay up. They had an agreement in which the contractors could defer paying the $1 billion that they owed, or whatever the amount was, which is unheard of. It's no precedent for it. They still haven't paid any money. They're supposed to pay when you get terminated for default and then come back and collect it. There are, the question is, what did the contractors actually deliver? Well, in their contract, there's a whole bunch of line items, and they delivered most all of that. After the contract was terminated, there was a video taken that I saw that showed all the parts that have been made, and you can basically see all the parts for an airplane. You could have put an airplane together with, I would say, almost a complete airplane with all those parts that were there. So it isn't as though they didn't do anything. Well, one of the big problems they ran into was curing the laminates that they were using with the special approach to building airplanes, which wasn't out of metal. It was out of composites. Well, who knew about that technology? Northrop knew about it. Lockheed knew about it. Navy didn't know about it. They could have told them in a heartbeat how to do it, but it was too late. The Navy is invoking the State Secrets Act, which I find somewhat ironic, because when Undersecretary of Defense Kaminsky was asked in his deposition, is there any technology from the A-12 program that is viable, that you can use, that's something that the government or the people can use? He said, no, not really. So here they're arguing about state secrets over an airplane where the Undersecretary of Defense, who is a specialist in stealth, says there's nothing in the A-12 program we need. The A-12 case, after 20 years, is now in the Supreme Court. They had oral argument in January of 2011. And one of the ironies is that when the A-12 contractors were ready to file their lawsuit, they talked to the government and said, tell you what, we won't sue you if you don't sue us. We'll just walk away. So here we are 20 years later. We're in the Supreme Court, and the argument is based on the State Secrets Act, which legally means the following. It means that the government, if it wants to invoke the State Secrets Act, is supposed to pay the contractors because it's for the privilege of taking the State Secrets Act. One lawyer I talked to, Herb Finster, who was the first attorney for the MAC Air GD team, said that a case called Windstar requires that they pay the contractors if they're going to invoke the State Secrets Act. What I found ironic was Justice Scalia argued, gee, that doesn't seem fair. Why don't you guys just walk away with what you've got now? So the whole thing has come around after 20 years to that being one of the arguments. And I don't know what's going to happen, but whatever happens, the taxpayer lost in the end. For years, the McDonnell Douglas company had been trying to sell the Navy an airplane they called the Hornet 2000, which was an airplane that was bigger than the F-18C and D, but it was going nowhere. Towards the end of the A-12 program, there was an argument being made that we should probably just stop the A-12 and put the money into the F-18 Hornet 2000, which was then being called the F-18E. There was a big meeting, study was done, and the study concluded that there's no way that the F-18E could do the job of the A-12 because you'd have to put RAM, this radar absorbing material, over all of its weapons which hang externally, and that it was absolutely inadequate for the job. The second that the A-12 program was canceled, they dusted off that Hornet 2000/F-18E and said, oh, this is the answer, because the Navy is paranoid about not having its aircraft carriers. And if they don't have an airplane, they don't have a justification for deep strike, which they call it, bombing the enemy way internally, then they have no justification for the carrier, and then basically the Navy has no justification for an air wing. So that was their very sensitive spot. So the airplane that they were bad-mouthing a month previously, a month later, they were saying, this is the answer, we can do this. And by the way, they violated all kinds of internal rules, getting that appropriated by just bypassing the rules that were required to justify the airplane in the first place.
They say the F-18 is just a remake of the old F-18. It's frankly 80% all new. The F-18 E and F, as one admiral put it to me, is good enough. And there is, as I say, a point where if you have an airplane too expensive, you can't buy enough of them to justify the carriers. Well, the F-18 E and F is plenty good enough for the threat out there. And it's easier to maintain than would have been the A-12. And yes, all pilots like to go fast and have fancy gadgetry in their airplane. But when you look at who's got any sophisticated airplanes out there, where is the threat? I mean, they talk about China, but China has only got a minuscule air force. They talk about Russia. Russia's more bankrupt than we are. So, in my view, what fails to be done is to justify a new product on the basis of an enemy, a potential enemy threat. That was never done, and it's never done. It's become a kind of a gee whiz game to how can I make it more sophisticated, more complicated. But I think it's time to call time out and say, hey, look, we're putting airplanes on a carrier. There's all kinds of corrosion problems. There's all kinds of training problems. You got to land at night. You got to land in rough seas. What are we doing here with all this fancy stuff that is marginally important? So, you know, they keep talking about automating carriers, and then they say, well, how do you fight a fire, which is the biggest single threat on an aircraft carrier? You get 5,000 kids on an aircraft carrier, and if something catches fire, it could be very explosive. And so every time they talk automation of a carrier to save money, they always end up saying, well, you need the firefighting capability, so we still got 5,000 people on a carrier. And it's very manpower intensive. It's a human wave attack to run a carrier. And same way with the planes. You've got amateurs out there on the flight deck who are doing very dangerous work, working their tails off 18 hours a day. Let's give these kids a break by making things less complicated. The aircraft carrier is the heart of the naval fleet. And you have to ask yourself the question, though, if you can't afford enough airplanes to justify 11 aircraft carriers, what are you going to put out there? So you're shooting yourself in the foot, in a sense, by having an airplane so expensive you can't afford to buy enough of them to fill up the decks of the carrier. And the present Secretary of Defense in our country, Bob Gates, has said, we've got 11 aircraft carriers and nobody else has more than one. And he made the point that that's a ridiculous ratio, but he said, quote, I'm not crazy. In other words, Congress loves the aircraft carriers too because the Navy's been lobbying for them forever. And so it's reaching a point of diminishing returns when you have an aircraft carrier which costs $30 to $40 billion. When I first started covering defense, it was $3 billion. And you've got a cruise missile which can disable the flight deck, which is all you have to do. You don't have to sink the carrier to put it out of service. I mean, what good is a carrier if it can't deliver ordnance on the target? What good is a carrier if it doesn't have airplanes it can take off? And so all you have to do is use $1 million cruise missile, surface-to-surface cruise missile, to disable the flight deck of a carrier for weeks. So you put it out of action, and what good is it going to do you off Libya, for instance, if they hit it with a surface-to-surface missile? So the whole mix is, to my mind, in need of a strategic review as opposed to this rubber stamping of what we're already doing, which is the quadrennial defense review, which Congress has mandated they do every 4 years. but it's a piece of boilerplate. It just justifies what we're doing. We really need a rigorous review of where we're going in defense. And to save money, I think Obama made a terrible mistake by giving defense a free pass and saying, we're going to cut everything but defense. And then he backed off and said, well, defense is on the table too. But Congress is not going to cut defense budget because they don't want to look weak on defense. B, they don't care whether a weapon works right or not, as long as it provides jobs in their home area. So we're in a military-industrial complex that doesn't make sense, in my view. Well, you know, one of the good things that Defense Secretary Robert McNamara did, he proved before Vietnam drowned him and Lyndon Johnson as well, that a dollar put in the civilian economy provides more jobs than a dollar put in a weapon. And that's the way he closed surplus bases. And I think we need to go back to sobering up and stop being on this high-tech binge we're on. A, to save money, and B, to get over the idea that any dollar spent in my home area as a politician is good for me because it promotes jobs. That same dollar put into highways or education would have more of a return. And he sold that concept early on in the 60s, but we've lost sight of it. And the fact that we're spending $1 trillion a year on national defense makes no sense at all to me.